Hello. Hello, everyone. Hi. Good easy afternoon or evening. Good evening. My name is Wana Odobang, and I will be moderating the panel here on defining home, place, and displacement in African writing. And of course, we have here Sarah Ladipo Manieka. Please give her a round of applause. Her current novel is called Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun, and it's, of course, in the bookstores. We also have Yewande Omotosho here. And her novel is called The Woman Next Door. Hopefully, at some point during the course of this, they will get to read little excerpts from their books. Teju Cole, of course, is our other panelist, who I think is on his way. But we will kick off, because we have to. We're talking about defining home, and I think a lot of people have watched the Taye Selassie TED Talk that says, "Don't ask me where I'm from, ask me where I'm local." And I think at that, I wanted to just ask both of you, in terms of this idea of home, is it as a construct, or is it a fluid thing? What is home to you, and where is it? Sarah?
So I haven't actually seen the TED Talk by Taye, so I should watch that at some point. Home, for me, is quite a fluid concept, I think. I was just thinking last night that my life thus far has sort of 3 chapters geographically. The first chapter being raised here in Nigeria and Kenya, so in the African continent, and then in Europe, in England and France. And now I live in America. So I feel that home for me is, to some extent, all of those places. So yeah, I'll start there.
Hello, everybody, firstly, and thank you, and thanks, Wana, and great to be here with you again, Sarah. It's interesting for me, because if I think of home, and perhaps this is because of my own personal obsession with motherhood, which I was talking about yesterday, or the other day. But I think mother and home are very connected for me, just from a very personal perspective. And home has always been complex, or fluid, similar to what you were saying, because I've moved around, and because my parents also didn't come from the same geographical home. But I know that when I lost my mother, the concept of home got a lot more complex. And even in this, the story about the woman next door, I notice, post having written the book, that I take pains to understand what the 2 mothers in the novel feel about home and their relationship to home. So there's something for me about how the idea of home is passed down to us from our parents, and even more specifically from our mothers, and what impact does that have on my notion of home, and what, those kind of very sticky connections that are hard to pry apart.
So have you ever thought about this concept of home for yourself beyond that inherited idea of home that you say is passed on from the mother?
Yeah. I mean, I think firstly, I don't know about this thing of beyond, so I take on that, not as a burden, or, I think sometimes we privilege, but what's your own, And I suppose what I'm saying is it's a lot more complicated than that. And I take it on. It doesn't feel like a burden. And so in thinking about my experience of home, or my sense of home, there's a lot that's encapsulated in that, including my own mother's home, or including the absence of my mother in my life. And so my sense of a physical home or a house becomes even more ephemeral and ghost-like.
I think something about that's common thread with all our panelists, including Teju as well, is a sort of hyphenated identity that you all possess, whether it is biologically, whether it is, or with heritage, spatially, geographically. In some way, you're constantly moving and traversing different spaces as well. And there seems to be this thing about sort of authentic. I want to just really know how that hyphenated identity for you influences the way in which you work your characters, the way in which you write about them. or the impact it has on that?
Well, I think, I'll just talk a little bit about the hyphenated identity for me, first of all. I think when I was younger, the experiences that have happened this week, for example, walking from the hotel down here and being followed by people saying, Oyingbo, what are you doing? Or in the north, Bature, similarly when I came through London, some unfortunate event where my passport wasn't reading properly and someone saying, oh, these bloody immigrants, So this whole experience of wherever I go, I don't quite fit, bothered me when I was younger. But now I think, for me there's both a privilege, there's an immense privilege of having had the exposure to 3 different continents in some depth. So the African continent, Europe, and America. And I think I'm, really drawing on that much more for my writing. My stories are placed in multiple locations that I'm somewhat familiar with, and this is as a result of my own personal background. But I think the other thing that I've noticed, and this is really a recent thing in the last few years, when you come from various places, there can tend to be a nostalgia, and there's great nostalgia for me, and great love for Nigeria. And what this has meant for me living in America is that I have probably followed international events much more closely than local events. And one of the things that I realized in the last few years is I do have to pay more attention to where I am actually living and get involved. And you'll see a bit of that in the book that I've just written with the homeless character. And I've just written an essay entitled This is San Francisco, and really looking at issues of social inequality in the place that I'm currently living.
What about you? And how, I'm asking about how your hyphenated identities influence or affect your work, or how you have to try constantly navigate through that. Is it something you think about consciously?
Yes, I think so. And I'm interested in the way we like to, or often, sometimes a kind of a lot of attention to the essential, like essentialist feeling. So I think we all have hyphenated identities, actually. Even if it might be the specificity around body, or there might be other things distinct from just nationality. And so I suppose I like to not make it this exclusive way of talking about certain people, or me feeling special because in a very obvious way I come from 3 cultures or something like that. And how that comes into my stories, I think, is that if I look at my characters, they're always hyphenated in some way. It doesn't matter what race they are. It doesn't matter that they were born in the same place and lived there and died there. I seem to always be interested in finding a way to hyphenate them, because I think we all are, and we can be blind to that because there's all this attention on people who are obviously that. But a lot of us are that in more overt ways, and I think it's useful to see that and acknowledge it.
I think that helps in the sensitivity that you attach to your characters when you write about them in any way.
I don't know. I mean, I think one of the main uses I do it also just to protect myself is because having lived in South Africa, it's very difficult for me to imagine this essential, this pure person. So it's very difficult for me to write this black South African character who's Xhosa, and everything is Xhosa, and there's nothing complex, and they haven't lived anywhere else, or the mother is also like this pure person, because I don't feel I have any access to that. Or another way of putting it, although I don't often think of it that way, is I don't necessarily have a right to that, or somehow I can't imagine it. But if I can hyphenate them, I can imagine it very easily, because I know that as a human being.
All right, Tejukul is here, of course, and Teju, earlier, before you got here, we're asking about the fact that I used the Taye Selassie TED Talk where she says, don't ask me where I'm from, ask me where I'm local. And first of all, the question I posed to the other 2 panelists was, what is home to you? What does it mean? Is it a construct? Is it a fluid thing? Because I know you've detailed that so many times with all these different categories. You say you don't mind being categorized as long as it's not one. Yeah, so as long as it's not just one category. You've described yourself as, people see you as African American, Nigerian, Brooklyn, you know, you have all these different categories, and you say you're fine with that as long as it isn't one. So what is this concept of home for you, first of all?
Well, hello everybody. I'm sorry I'm late. I was mysteriously busy. I can't say more about it. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with these lovely ladies. I would simply be happy listening to you talking all day long. But let me sort of... Yes, so in that case, please. Okay. I absolutely agreed with what Yewande had to say just now, actually, which is the idea that the hyphenated identity becomes something that it can be a little bit of a distraction simply because it's obvious. So if somebody is Scottish Nigerian, then that's what, you know, it's obvious. Somebody's Nigerian American. One of the most striking experiences that I have regularly in a place like this festival in particular is that I meet so many people who want to talk to me about my work and about their work, who are not obviously hyphenated, but who have a complex and cosmopolitan engagement with the world in a sort of low-key and fully integrated way. And this might be somebody who's never actually lived outside Nigeria, or two Nigerian parents, always lived here. I think that is the more interesting place of engagement. The fact that there is a commonality that goes well beyond where we live and whatever hyphenations we embed in our biographies. There's a way where we meet on the page and we get each other. And for me, that is not any less profound in this environment than it is if I'm doing this in Brooklyn. So home is where your people are, you know, and who are your people? Your people who are those people who share certain sympathies with you, but also have certain general broad bases on which to think about what society should begin to look like. And you find those people everywhere. Like, there are people in this room I've not met, and I'm sure that you're part of my people, because once we start having this conversation, we say that, yeah, this is generally where society should be moving. And so I feel as at home here as I would anywhere in the world wherever there are such people.
Thank you. I want to talk about sort of this idea of an authentic experience, authentication of experience, because I think that's a question that comes up with African writers in diaspora, living and writing from the diaspora, and the idea of an authentic experience in their writing, and that sort of link with ownership of culture or cultural ownership. And I want to know if that ever burdens your work, or people burden your work with that in any way, or question it, or question the experiences of your characters because of this connection between having stayed in a certain space for a long enough time to claim ownership of culture.
Okay. I think that's something that I try not to be too worried about. In the book that I've just written, I've written about an almost 75-year-old Nigerian woman. I don't know if that's authentic because I'm not quite 75. I've written about an African-American man. I'm not an African-American man. Palestinian shopkeeper, a white homeless woman. So I think as fiction writers, you know, maybe the focus is particularly on some of us for particular reasons, but all of us as writers, if we are writing fiction, we are imagining things, and we do the best that we can to make the characters authentic.
So following on from that, why do you think writers like you sometimes, people do burden that on you, this idea of representing, because you talk about the fact that you can write about history and a time and nobody questions that. But once it comes to writing about a certain place or this idea of home, in quotes, it becomes, a bone of contention sometimes.
I was talking to someone earlier today and I said, and one thing I forgot to say at the top of this is thank you to Ake. This is just wonderful. And thank you especially to all the people working behind the scenes, camera people, everyone, thank you. And now I'm getting carried away with my thank yous. But no, I was saying to someone earlier that this festival is so important because it brings together so many voices, it inspires so many new writers, and I cannot wait for a time when I hardly know the names of the thousands and thousands and thousands of African writers, and I think when we get to that stage, it becomes less an issue of, are you being authentic? Do you really know what you're talking about in Nigeria or in Zimbabwe or whatever, So I think when you don't, in the grander scheme of things, don't have a large body of literature, and of course that's growing and growing, then those questions become, are more salient. But the more writers we have, the more those questions will subside, I believe.
Yeah, I think that, it's important to have an element of irreverence in this profession, and so I particularly, although there's, chatter and there's noise and people critique all sorts of things, I try not to be burdened. I try not to be burdened by anything when it comes to writing my fiction, and I try and really do whatever it is I want to do. Once it's done, then people can say you fell short, or you didn't quite hit the mark, or you did, or it's in between, and that's allowed. But I think at the point of creating it, what a pity to already start weighing it down with all that kind of stuff of, is it authentic? And so similar to what you were saying, Sarah, I mean, in this novel, one of the main characters is white, she's Jewish. I mean, yes, I did the research, but I didn't belabor the fact that I'm not white and I'm not Jewish, and my job is to imagine. So I jumped into that and said, well, let me try and imagine. And then somebody will meet me and tell me you didn't quite do it right. Just to blow my horn for about 5 seconds, I then met a woman who is Israeli, and she asked me if I would perform with her, and I played Hortensia and she played Marion, who are the two characters. And as we were rehearsing, she was rehearsing her lines in this conversation, and the line I had written was something like, when I die, I want my children to say good things about me. These women are in their 80s, and they're having this conversation about when they die. And Marion is saying, when I die, I want my children to say good things about me. I want, so-and-so to come and say stuff. And Judith, who's the Israeli woman, she said, what you're basically saying is, you want them to say Kaddish. And I said, I don't know what that is. And she said, no, but I know you don't, and you didn't know that's what you were writing. But as a Jewish person, I know that's what you're writing. And she changed the lines. And I thought that was interesting, because that was a meeting. I didn't have that language. I clearly didn't read that bit of my research. But essentially, this was the experience of a Jewish mother wanting her children to say Kaddish. So I think that's possible sometimes, and I think it might only happen on one page. It might not always happen on every single page of the book, but that's the magic of allowing yourself to imagine into something that might not be your immediate personal experience.
Yeah, it's something that happens with when your book is out there in the world, and then critics have things to say about it, and not always professional critics, lots of freelance critics as well. And if the inquiries are not particularly smart, of course it can be aggravating. So for me, maybe the first step was getting to the point where I said, well, what people who don't like the attitudes or the approach in my work doesn't bother me. But I found an even more helpful stance, which is that, in fact, it provides a kind of helpful friction that helps the work keep moving forward. Not that my feelings are never involved, but in the sense that even inquiries that are not so perceptive can help give us a clearer picture of what's at stake and what are we talking about. So for example, if somebody, I don't get this question too often, I often get a version of it, I sometimes get a version of it, and it's pretty much, well, you know, who are you writing for? Do you think you're writing for white people? You know, and the answer in my head is, well, who are the black people you know? And the person asking could be black, but it's like, who are the black people you have in mind that you think this is not for? And where does that thinking come from? So answering it that way in my head helps me clarify why I love quoting Steve Biko, who says, I write what I like. And I like it because it's accurate, but also because it sounds a bit arrogant, and that is not allowed. And so we have to be. What we have to offer as writers is not simply the content of our work, where we try to be more than entertainers. If some entertainment happens, well, that's great. If it provides some company and some consolation, wonderful. That's all part of it. But part of what we also offer is our willingness to go against the grain of what's expected. To be free in a way that many people do not even allow themselves to be. So the moment somebody says, well, why is that tone in your work? Why is that attitude? Or why have you put this? I didn't like that. People say that, I didn't like that book. They're not trying, often they're not trying to be mean. They're trying to inform me that they thought my book was shit. Just so I know. And, you know, and in that case, I'll respond and I'll say, oh, well, that's interesting, because actually it's a pretty good book. It's quite good. Because that example of doing your own thing, going your own way, regardless of who's uncomfortable, becomes part of what you offer to the world. It's contagious, hopefully.
You know, I think, Teju, I was interested in something that you said earlier, and you said, you know, home is where my people are. And I've been thinking about that in the last few days, and I agree with you on that to a certain extent. But I remember there were a group of us who did the school visits earlier in the week, and I was with Orisa, who was trying to get the students to talk about writing, and he was using the example of, you know, if you write love notes to the people that you love, you know, you're beginning the practice of your craft. And of course, there was complete silence in the school because the headmistress was there, the teachers were there. They were not going to talk about their love notes. And then one very brave person said, we use WhatsApp, you know. So I mean, this notion of home and this notion of belonging and authenticity, you know, Orisa is living here in Lagos. I haven't lived in Lagos for ages, and yet there was a disconnect generationally. And you know, that notion of belonging changes on so many different levels. And this is something that I've also been exploring in my latest book, and Yewande in her book, looking at older characters. You know, where do we belong in societies that don't necessarily value those who age?
Yewande, where does belonging come in your work for you? Even in terms of personal belonging and how you put that into your characters or into the work that you're doing.
Well, belonging is very important to me because I guess it's something I've always been aware of. Even when I grew up here, and then as a 12-year-old when we moved to South Africa, and it was 1992. So belonging was complex because I was moving into a country, fine, I was new there, but in terms of who lived there, even the people living there are dealing with belonging. Even now we're dealing with issues of land and ownership. All of that is tied to belonging. You know, what is your space in this country and in these cities in this country? So it just kept on being compounded. So because it's something that I guess I've always been wrapped up in, I think it's a common kind of thread that's woven through the stories that I write. It's just it's just there when I start making stuff up.
Are you, Teju? Have you ever had any issues with belonging, moving between spaces, and does that affect or influence any part of your work?
I mean, I think it's about recognizing the way the math never quite adds up. You're 100% at home in Nigeria and then 100% at home in the US because nobody can tell you to go elsewhere. So that's 200%. It's not really working that way. And meanwhile, I feel tremendously at home in a hotel room in the first 10 minutes before I've messed up the bed, but the Wi-Fi is working and I know I'm sleeping here tonight. You know, it's some country I've never been to. I really feel at home in that space. But I'll give you an example of something that felt very vividly and movingly like belonging to me. It was when I arrived here for the festival. I arrived in Lagos, and my dad had picked me up. I was on my way home from the airport. And this was the day when, the previous night, there had been that tanker accident on the express. And as it happens in Lagos, waves of disorder had spread throughout the city. And so for the entire day, traffic had just been absolutely awful. And we also sort of got into it on our way back from the airport. And the entire time we were listening to traffic radio, which people were calling in. Obviously, it's that typical Lagos combination of they're frustrated. I left VI at 5 o'clock. It's 9 now. I've only reached Ojota. Let me just tell you, this is, you know. And the host, she's been very conciliatory. She's listening, but she's got this beautiful dry irony, this sarcasm. Some people are calling, frankly, just to flirt with her, but also to report on their traffic situation. And she's handling it all so well. Sometimes people just want somebody to talk to. I have to say, we have traffic radio in the US, but listening to people complain about traffic, and the host, I can't remember her name, Titi Lokbe maybe or something, and she's like, Bele, you know, it's going to be okay. I'm praying for you to get home safe, you know. Like, there was just sort of this tenderness in it. I felt at home, and not in a sort of ironic or cynical way at all. I felt at home inside their interaction. Everybody could understand everybody's suffering, and it's like, don't worry, you'll be home soon, just stay safe. Some guy called and said, all these people calling to complain about traffic, listen, you're already in it. So just pray that you get home safe. There's no complaining about the traffic is already there. So that was just such a Nigerian, that was a language I knew. And that was, in a strange kind of way, it was intimate. So when you're in Nigeria, when I arrived in Nigeria from the US, you know Nigeria now, it's a forest of accents. Everybody's doing their own. And there's something in the infinite varieties of Nigerian Englishes that I consider home to myself also.
Teju, thank you for yapping us completely. Sarah wants to respond. She wants to say something.
So when I listen to you, Teju, what I hear you saying is you're feeling at home with storytelling. And and I think this brings us back to literature and this notion of home through literature. So one of the most striking things for me has been seeing, being with No Violet, being with Tendai, being with Alain, people from different backgrounds and cultures, and seeing writers come up to them and say, I really enjoyed your book, or I really, and that's the power of literature. We can all find belonging, we can all find homes in literature, and that's, to me, is very powerful. So.
Sarah, you talk about nostalgia as well. You talked about that earlier when we were having conversation. And there seems a lot of the time in a lot of African literature, there seems this romantic relationship with physical space and geographical space. And I'm wondering, what your thoughts are in terms of how nostalgia informs this romanticism sometimes that can be a little bit skewed, can be just a hyper-romanticized, so to speak.
I don't know if I have anything. I don't know, Yewande or Teju, if you have anything to say on that. I mean, it's also a question of, how readers respond to particular works. I don't know.
I think that for me, the two are distinct. I mean, I know I have nostalgia. You know, I have a deep love, you know, and nostalgia for my childhood in Ile-Ife and what that was like, and I hold that very dear. And that's all mixed up, and it's nostalgic, and I think it should be. You know what I mean? There was a gentleman I met, Niran, I'm not sure, but we met in the bookshop, and he reminded me that he knew my brothers and they went to the same school in Ife, and we were talking about growing up on a university campus and how it was like a bubble and all this other stuff was going on in the country, and our parents managed to just hold this space for us. And he was saying, you know, we were oblivious. And I said to him, you know, we ought to have been oblivious, we were children. So I mean, it's okay that the nostalgia is there. When it comes to the writing, I try and I think you can be tender about a memory, and you can also be you can also have horror, you can also have sadness, you can also, you know, you can temper it with all the emotions and all the facets of experience. But in terms of my own memories, I really allow them to be nostalgic, because it's a beautiful thing for me.
Has nostalgia always served you well, Teju?
Yeah, not exactly nostalgia. It's about trying to really engage with the present as well as whatever was in the past, but hopefully in a way that is not sentimental. I'm quite averse to sentimentality. And yet, there are those moments of, it's a punctum, something breaks through the calm surface of the everyday and just takes you back to some place. Sometimes you don't even know exactly where it's taking you. I remember I was at Kennedy Airport, I was on some flight to somewhere not home. I was on my way to Sweden or something. I'm standing in line, checking in, and I don't know, maybe the past few weeks I'd just been around Oyibo people all the time. The woman behind me, I'd not even seen her, but she was carrying a child, and she said, "Shoti Joan." That's all it was. But tears came to my eyes, because aren't those the most beautiful words in the language, really?
Translate for those who don't understand.
You know? Because I just wanted to, you know, sort of, I saw it was, have you eaten yet, in Yoruba, in a context in which I did not expect to hear the language. And yeah, it just took me to a place, and I wanted to turn around and say, "No, can you feed me?" You know? So I guess that I don't go looking for it, and it's not tied to childhood, but there are these moments where you're sort of ambushed by, and it's similar to what I was experiencing listening to the radio.
That when people write about, you know, writers write about this home because we're talking about defining home. There's always this, again, we talked about the burden of representation, but again, this burden of commentary, the need to, you're supposed to be commenting on something, a social situation. I want to know your thoughts on that idea. Do you think we probably need to also start, you know, just bury that a little bit and start focusing on form and content and style and technique?
Well, I'll just talk about my own personal experience with this book that I've just finished, Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun. I think for many writers, and certainly this was my experience, you know, as I was writing this particular story, I found myself wanting to put in stories about race, you know, issues. We've all been following the news in America, shootings of black men and women reported, captured on video, and so forth. And I found myself torn between wanting to write a story about race and then a story about my main character, Morayo. And for me, I just had to separate these two things and relegate, you know, realize that actually I needed to write some nonfiction on issues and so forth that I wanted to unravel in terms of race. And so that's how I dealt with that myself.
You had to sort of start compartmentalizing in some way.
Yeah, I had to realize I can't, I don't want to burden my fiction with everything that's in my head. And and knowing the place and time to write and tell particular stories is something that I have learned and continue to learn over time.
Yeah, Andy, what about you? We're often, having to comment about issues back home, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Sarah's saying, because I think it's a delicate line that there is to walk there, and there are a few thoughts that come to mind. And the first one is that, propaganda really makes, I think, bad fiction, and that you can bury what is really beautiful about fiction by putting message. And my brother often says, if you want to send a message, go to the post office. Like, that's the medium. And it's not, the fiction isn't the medium. But what I also think, because I am political, and there are things that I'm interested in, like you were saying, you were dealing with, you do have commentary about these things, and you sometimes attempt to weave it into the fiction. Amata Aidu said this really amazing thing when she was talking about the same idea, and she was talking about how it's from the imagination. Now, if you are lucky enough to have a politicized imagination, then the politics kind of bubbles up quite naturally and fits really neatly and doesn't weigh down, doesn't drag, the narrative. That's the ideal. And I think in terms of craft, that's what I'm working towards. But while you can't do that, just beware of, the political tract disguised as a novel.
Taju, what are your thoughts? Is there a middle ground for it as well? Is there a middle ground, from what Yewande talks about, how you can be nuanced about it, but, not be a political ground?
Yeah, I totally agree with Sarah and Yewande on this. It's worth thinking about. I mean, one of the things that does strike me goes back to what I was saying earlier about being free, and your freedom is what you have to offer. This book has 55 essays, and it's 55 different subjects. Part of the trace I would like to leave is this: somebody to come away from my work and think, this guy just does whatever the hell he wants. That freedom, like, he does what he wants, what the hell? Or he does what he wants, I like that, But just have that freedom be centered. But at the same time, look, we're sitting here, we have microphones on, and people are listening to us. That's like an amazing privilege. And with that privilege sort of comes a responsibility as well. And so, in my head, the responsibility is between, I do what I want, but somebody's put a microphone in my hand in the hopes that I might help move a dial somewhere. That's a negotiation every day between freedom and duty, and to bring them closer and closer together, and to not give up on either of them. Maybe to redefine the duty in a way that it comes out in a free way. Hoping.
We don't want to monopolize the conversation, and I'm sure you guys want to hear them read a little bit, right? Yes? So our panelists are going to read for just about 2 minutes each, 2 to 3 minutes, little short excerpts from their books. So we'll start with Sarah, and then we'll go straight to the audience after that.
So I'm going to read from the beginning of, somewhat towards the beginning of my book, in my main character's voice. I don't think I need to set it up. She's about to celebrate a birthday, and she's thinking about the birthday, so you'll get a sense of that, and you'll get a sense of her home, which has been fluid. She's lived in different places, etc. I have 2 traditions when it comes to birthdays. The first is to buy shoes. Oh, and this year's shoes are gorgeous. On the outside, they are a deep, plush scarlet red. And because it's a big birthday, I match the shoes with my black chiffon dress and double string of pearls. Pearls that have accompanied me to all manner of places, from lunch with Mrs. Gandhi, to tea at Buckingham Palace, to this little place in San Francisco, where I really must get round to replacing the broken glass in my full-length mirror. I climb onto the ledge of the bath and I hold firmly to the edge of the door to balance. This way, I can see both the shoes and the dress in the bathroom mirror, and I can imagine right there where I place the palm of my hand, the spot for a tattoo. For this is my second tradition, to do something new and daring with each passing year. Last year it was scuba diving, and the year before learning to swim, because you can't scuba dive if you don't swim. This year it's the tattoo, and it's not just the fact of getting a tattoo, but it's where I intend to have it done that thrills me. I've decided that something on the wrist or the ankle would be too ordinary, and this was my reason for wanting to talk to my bakery friend. I was hoping to ask her what she thought of bougainvillea, of a long, fine thread of it winding its way up my back. My bakery friend has a Chinese dragon that spreads across her back with its feet perched on her thigh. She showed it to me unprompted one day and explained how it represented her family's heritage. She said she had done it in 3 sittings to manage the pain. I wonder how long it will take to do my flowers. Not long, I hope, because I really don't like needles. I cringe at the thought of all those childhood vaccinations for nasty diseases: tetanus, typhoid, diphtheria, yellow fever. I wonder now if it might be better to choose a design that is smaller. Perhaps I should just have a small sprig of bougainvillea, something like the size of one of Daoud's gifts, inked at the base of my neck. I'd never have the courage for something as big as a dragon. But perhaps I could have a tiny little blossom, symbolic of the tropical climes that I so love. Yes, I'm beginning to think that this is a good idea. What could be more perfect to mark my 75th birthday than this? I twist for a better view, and then, in mid-twist, I slip.
So you guys know you have a lot of books to buy, right? Yeah.
Okay. So this is just connecting kind of what we've been talking about, home, but also connecting that to memory, which I guess also links to the earlier discussion before this. When Marian was 11, old enough to make accusations and old enough to know fear when she saw it, she asked her mother, why hadn't they given her anything, not even a religion, not even some uncles or aunties, nothing to remember, no rituals? The question had come from a place of loneliness, from a feeling that 3 did not really make a family. Her mother decided to talk about something she'd never spoken of. She told Marian that she, Marian, was born on the 21st of June in 1933. Marian, of course, knew this already. When she interrupted to say so, her mother raised a hand in a gesture that was unfamiliar, and so, for this reason, Marian hushed and listened. Her mother had been pregnant on the ship. She and her husband sailed for South Africa from London, leaving behind the dormitory house they had lived in with so many others for a few months. It had all been a jumble of nightmares and rain. On the Blue Mary, her mother had been sick often, sick with the sea, but also sick with the baby, sick too with fear and a close sense of what is ugly about the world, what it is like to be hunted. She stood on the deck. Marian's mother explained to her when the seas calmed and she saw the shining waters of the Atlantic Ocean. No one could ever know, but standing on the deck of the ship one evening, she'd considered jumping. Her bits of sick were bobbing down below on the waves. She felt a madness, like a fever, and the only thing to end it would be to jump, fling herself and the unborn child over the edge, give them both a simple kind of peace. She held onto the rails, and as if it was a fast wind, the feeling passed. She reasoned that if she could get away from the dark place they had come from, not just physically, then she could be all right. She decided to make herself forget, and she vowed that henceforth, for every remembrance anyone, even her husband, attempted to inflict on her, she would slap it away. Because this would be a new life, away from a land that had turned on itself. And in the new life, there would be no need for remembering. She wanted to forget, and she wanted to be forgotten. After all the horrific attention, she longed to simply slip through life unnoticed. Marian was surprised to hear her mother say so much, but it was a carefully made story with nothing fraying along its edges. Marian never asked again.
Don't really like television that much, and so whenever I accidentally see it, it sort of startles me. I like web series and movies or whatever. Something like Fox News in the US, do you guys know what the reputation of Fox News is? It's like actively malevolent. But CNN is a different issue. I think they're just dumb. They're just daft. And you all get CNN here, so you know what I'm talking about. They repeat the same things over and over again. They like a good tragedy because it gives them a reason for living. They love plane crashes, we know that. And a few years ago, they had the next best thing to a plane crash. They had Ebola. They loved that. We're continuing to monitor the situation. And on October 2014, there was a chyron. That's a word for, you know, the scrolling text below the TV screen. And they had a chyron that was like, Ebola, the ISIS of biological agents. And that was such a perfect CNN sentence that I had to write a piece in response to it. And I called the piece, What It Is. Is Ebola the ISIS of biological agents? Is Ebola the Boko Haram of AIDS? Is Ebola the Al-Shabaab of dengue fever? Some say Ebola is the Milosevic of West Nile virus. Others say Ebola is the Ku Klux Klan of paper cuts. It's obvious that Ebola is the flight MH370 of flight MH17. But at some point, the question must be asked whether Ebola isn't also the Narendra Modi of sleeping sickness. And I don't mean to offend anyone's sensitivities, but there's more and more reason to believe that Ebola is the Sonny Abacha of having trouble peeing. At first, there was understandably the suspicion that Ebola was the Hitler of apartheid, but it became abundantly clear that it is actually the George W. Bush of being forced to listen to someone's podcast. The World Health Organization calls it the Putin of Stalin. In layperson's term, that's like saying it's a Stalin of U2. If you don't want to go that far, you have to at least admit that Ebola is the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb of stage 4 brain cancer. It could become airborne and turn into the Tea Party of extreme climate events. Throughout the country of Africa, Ebola is the Abu Ghraib of think pieces. I'm not politically correct, so I'm just going to put this out there. Ebola is the neo-Nazism of niggling knee injuries. The threat it poses to the American way of life essentially makes it the North Korea of peanut allergies. Ebola, the Obama of Osama, but don't quote me, is literally the some of my best friends are black of hashtag not all men. But the burning question no one has yet raised is whether Ebola is the Newsweek of halitosis. But I want to open the discussion up to our panel and ask whether Ebola is merely the Fox News of explosive incontinence or whether the situation is much worse than that. and Ebola is in fact the CNN of CNN. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for all the amazing readings. We'll open it up to the audience. Please put your hand up. I think we have someone with the microphone. The lady over here has had a hand up first. And then I have a gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Nana. I've just become increasingly uncomfortable with the idea that home could be anywhere, right? Because I think it's only a privileged few that can claim that. At the same time, I can also recognize the claiming of home as wherever you are as an act of resistance. But I'm also thinking about the many people who cannot claim homes elsewhere, even when their own homes are devastated. And I'm just wondering if you show that in any of your writings. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, and I think, my own ability to move from continent to continent is something that many, many people cannot do. And, I feel that I have a responsibility. I personally, want to write and at the very least, notice those who do not have the same privilege as I do. So, you're asking if we write about these things. In my book, there are characters, such as the homeless character and, refugee character, Palestinian, that I shine a small light on.
I don't have I think that's accurate, and I think that it's a brilliant comment and challenge as well. And I definitely, I suppose in my story, because what you're talking about there is economics and class, and I wanted to look at that in this novel as well, because the two main characters are incredibly wealthy, actually. More money to live, enough money to live several lifetimes very comfortably. And there are characters in the novel that aren't that. And I try and deal with race, but also deal with that extreme amount of privilege, or even my level of privilege as a middle-class person. So it's a great comment, and thanks for mentioning that.
I feel as if displacement is one of the subjects I keep returning to. Like in this book, for example, I've written about people who are living in Brazil, don't necessarily feel at home there. I've written about Nigerians living in Rome who are not necessarily at home there. I went to Palestine, wrote about that. I went to the US-Mexico border, wrote about people who are crossing there and that difficulty. But what interests me more is, and I want to challenge you back, this idea that, moving around is necessarily a privileged position. It's a position of extreme deprivileging as well. If somebody asked me to give a prognostication for the future of our planet, I think the most accurate thing I can say is that there's going to be a lot of migration. That is going to be the primary and most immediate effect of climate change. A lot of people are going to move to a lot of different places. So starting in our discourse to make it real, this idea that nobody is actually tied to one piece of earth, and that idea of authenticity and nation is actually on its way out, that this is our planet, we're going to have to manage it one way or the other. I think that's very much going to be a reality, and it's something I try to look at from both sides, both on the side of the author who's staying in the hotel room, but also the fact that if somebody walks over from Mexico, you bloody well should let them stay, because that's not a trivial thing to do.
We have a gentleman over there.
Thank you. Ogbu Godwin Ikechukwu. We are talking about defining home and displacement. And being a Nigerian living here who has not been outside Nigeria, I'm thinking about much of us who are parents left our state to go elsewhere for, most Nigerian people leaving their rural areas to go to Lagos and Abuja. And they're giving birth to kids there who ordinarily do not know a lot about where they naturally come from. I think that's displacement. But most time when we're talking about it, we're often talking about those living in Nigeria, those who have more than one national identity. I mean, looking at the constitution of this panel, it's very easy for me to tell what our idea of displacement is. So I want us to comment on that.
I think you're completely correct. I think we could just grab 3 people from this audience and they could do it just as well as we did. I agree.
I think we also did say in the beginning when we were talking about this idea of hyphenated and it's unfortunate in a way that the 3 of us are hyphenated in a very obvious way, or in a rather very flat way or one-dimensional way. But it's just one way. It's not so. So you're right, and I think it's important not to make it this exclusive club of this bunch of people have these complex identities. That's wrong, I think. So yeah, I agree with you.
Do we have any? We have a gentleman over there.
I'm JP Abdul. Well, I have a Ghanaian father and a Nigerian mother. When my dad was alive, he made us realize that we are Ghanaians. That is the identity we're from. But when he died, I realized that I have to move out and meet people outside there, and they make me realize I'm not part of the society. And sometimes I feel dejected, and I think there is a void of identity I have to feel that is not well visible to me. Don't you also feel the same way?
Do you feel that there's a void of identity? Is that your question? Okay.
Oh, right. So he said his father's Ghanaian and your mother's Ghanaian and Nigerian, and he was raised to think of himself as Nigerian. Hold on. You were raised to think of yourself as Ghanaian, mixed Ghanaian, but that after his father died, he actually felt rejected by Nigerian society as sort of treated as a foreigner. And is that something you've experienced?
Sort of saying something similar to what I said before, that wherever I go, I'm not completely that. So I'm Oyinbo here, and it's like, really, you're really from Nigeria? And similarly, in England, questioning, black, British. In America, I have this British accent. But at the same time, to respond to this, the person who asked a question earlier, I'm also very cognizant of my own privilege. So, these are, there's a certain discomfort in terms of wanting to claim my Nigerianness and claim my Britishness and so forth. But, I am lucky to be able to claim these various places.
I mean, what I would say, maybe to address the void part, so I'm trying to find where his face is, particularly because you talked about when your father passed away. I mean, I really, and I said it earlier, when my mother passed away 13 years ago, when she died, for the first time, I got really confused about where home is. Physical home, as in house. Because I'd grown up in one house in Ile-Ife. We'd left that home. We'd moved to South Africa. I'd grown up in this other house. My mom passed away. My father moved out. He sold the house. I packed the house. So that house also went, and I was of age, so I needed to kind of find a flat. And there was this sense of feeling bereft, because you're missing a kind of and it is, for me anyway, it was a maternal kind of hearth a space that you can always return to. So I can relate when you talk about void. But also, like Sarah says, I mean, I've never had any sense of angst about belonging. People want to tell me, oh, you're not Nigerian, or South Africans are like, oh, you don't, you're not South African because you don't do X, Y, Z, or my Bayesian family say, oh, you're not Bayesian for this reason. I don't really bother with them because I think it's the job of people to have all sorts of opinions and ideas. But I can hold close what's real for me, which is that I am all those things. There's no angst linked to it. The angst I experienced came with the death of my parents. So I commiserate in that sense.
We have a gentleman here.
Hello. So I've listened to you three about the sense of belonging and sense of home anywhere in the world, kind of. What about the lack of it? That is to say, the lack of that sense of belonging anywhere. Because I remember the first time I spent almost 10 years in France, and every point I kept changing the title. The first time I said, I was just working in France. I have a company I worked with there. Then later it became, I'm just schooling in France. Then it became, I'm on a self-imposed exile in France. I'd never wanted to use that term immigrant because I didn't wanted it, and I actually felt like the idea of being a foreigner in this space is very enriching to my art. That is to say, I can actually distance myself from that space, and I can also say, well, I'm not in Nigeria, so I can have that sense of not being obliged to be in any form of allegiance or belonging to a space. Then eventually as an artist, I can see very clearly about what I want to say. What do you say about that one?
I think definitely as an artist and as a writer, there are benefits to having that distance, to being able to see something and, arguably not being accepted fully, and you can have that perspective. But I think, as I said earlier, one of the things that I've realized as someone who's living in America now is that there also comes a certain responsibility to still engage in the local. And I, for one, am one person who hasn't engaged enough in the local issues in where I'm living currently. It's interesting to think about the American election and to think about Brexit and so on and so forth. There are quite a few of us, I think, who have these international senses of belongings. And I think we need to also really pay attention to what is happening in our backyard, whether we feel we are American or wherever we happen to be living. It's important to engage in what's happening in wherever you're living.
Can we take 2 more questions? Okay, we have this a gentleman over there and one over here. And then it's a wrap.
Hello, my name is Afolabi. My question is about who has the right to write what. So, for instance, you're a Yoruba person, but you're writing about people in the Niger Delta, or you're a white American, but writing about Nigerian scammers. So, essentially, isn't it problematic when you have, let's say, a more culturally powerful person from another country, or someone who's more privileged, writing about people from a different area, and that gets seen as the access to knowledge about that area? So, I mean, right now in the world, people from certain parts of the world are more likely to get published than others, and they are the ones who are writing about our continent. And when you want to learn about our continent, you go to whatever they've written, as opposed to people from here being seen as, reservoirs of knowledge, essentially.
Okay, so it's a great question, it's a very smart question. And the answer is that we have to struggle to bring that world into being. I mean, what you've said, it's accurate, but it's also, it's clear, it's uncontroversial in that sense. But then the responsibility that devolves to the person who is in a subaltern position, that responsibility is now not simply to write it, but to write it well, make it good, make it good enough that it becomes the reference. I would not say that it's problematic for them to write about us. I would say the problem is that we're not writing back sufficiently. Just as they're free to write what they want, we're free to write what we want. If I say to myself, I write what I like, I have to recognize that right for anybody else. And that is doubly why I have to insist on that right for myself. You see what I mean? So the work is for us to do, absolutely.
I think I want to underline that and agree, and also say while we do that, we also have these wonderful opportunities to support things like Ake, local publishers, local writers. The more we can do that, the more we can make a big, big difference.
Unfortunately, I've been told my time is up. I'm so sorry we can't take that final question. Big thank you to our panelists, Sarah Ladipo Manika, Yewande Omotosho, Teju Cole. Please make sure you go out to get their books. And thank you all so much for being a wonderful audience.